and welcome to my theatre presentation on melodrama as a theatre tradition. Melodrama originated from the word melodrame, a word which was often used to signify a dramatic piece of music. The etymology of this word comes from melos in Greek and drame in French, meaning music and drama respectively. The first instance of this word being used within a theatre context, as we know it today, was in 1802 in Thomas Holcroft's A Tale of Mystery, a melodrama, which was described as that and later on came to mean the theatre tradition melodrama. Next slide, please. Melodrama as a theatre tradition originated from mainly medieval morality plays, which were performed in the 15th and 16th century. Within these plays, different characters personified vices, virtues, and concepts, like greed or lust. Because of this, these characters were often very simple, as were the plot lines. These plays were also very religiously inclined, often put on by religious groups and supported by churches, and were all used to teach religious moral lessons about how good triumphs over evil. This translates into melodrama as we know it today, both in the simple, easy to understand characters and in the moral lesson. Next slide, please. Melodrama was influenced mainly by two historical events. The French Revolution was the first of these. In the 18th century, the French Revolution, seen as the People's Revolution, did away with icons of the past, such as the church, but also the theatre. Because the traditional realist theatre was done away with and not performed anymore after the French Revolution, there was a vacuum which needed its place being filled. Melodrama worked well as the theatre after the French Revolution for several reasons. Firstly, it was useful because many French peasants were able to understand it even if they were illiterate, because of how exaggerated it was. Now the characters were easy to understand. But also, because melodrama presented moral lessons and had good triumph over evil, it was a useful moral substitute for the church, as in France there wasn't many, and France religion was seen as the main moral guidance before the revolution, so melodrama translated well into another form of moral guidance. The Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century was important in relation to melodrama for several reasons. First, the Industrial Revolution led to increased income for many people, which meant they could spend more on leisure, such as theatre, but also it led to higher rates of production, such as sewing machines and better lighting for theatre companies. This would mean shows could be put on with more frequently and with higher quality, with all this leading to increased revenue, so that theatre companies became more frequent and melodrama became more prominent. According to Britannica.com, escapism was also a key feature of the Industrial Revolution, with many working conditions being gloomy and often long hours. The enhanced exaggeration of melodrama and almost out of this world was seen as a way to escape those conditions and for workers to enjoy themselves. Next slide, please. A melodrama features three key stereotypes that are seen throughout all plays, as well as two lesser known ones. The three key stereotype figures, which are always represented by characters, are the hero, the protagonist of the play, the villain character, who is the antagonist of the play, and the damsel in distress, who is usually the love interest of the play. These three characters have their own qualities, which I'll talk about shortly, but there are also two lesser known characters who are often seen in melodrama plays, who I will discuss briefly. One of these is the sidekick, a character often used for comedic purposes and to further the plot, and the other is the old man, or damsel in distress's father, who is seen as a victim of the villain and is used to further the plot by asking the hero for help often. Next slide, please. I was able to find out a lot about these three main archetypal stereotypes, stock characters, the hero, villain, and damsel in distress, by looking at pictures such as these of original melodrama sketches and performances. And I was able to draw from these, as well as other sources, which I'll talk about later, what the qualities of these various characters were. Next slide. For the hero, the masculine pose, lower general voice, lower energy, and hands being used for dramatic effect were some key techniques that the hero would often employ. The hero was also, in melodrama plays, supposed to be the brave figure representing all that is good and right. He often comes in to save the damsel in distress from the villain and acts as the leading force of good within the play. Next slide. As you can see from these photos, the damsel in distress is a much different character. Next slide. The damsel in distress often speaks a much higher register for a more feminine voice, often uses more pleading and sorrowful expressions, being often the victim of the villain and moving the play along in that sense. Also is much higher energy often, as well as always being a kinder figure who is, like the hero, a morally good character, but unlike the hero, not strong enough to defend herself from danger or the villain. I explored these qualities, as well as others, as you can see behind me here, by taking what I heard from a variety of sources and what I learned and employing them for myself and seeing how effective these methods were and why. Next slide, please. The villain is the last of the archetypal stock characters in Melodrama, and as you can see here, he has some techniques that make him stand out from our first two characters. Next slide, please. The villain often talks in a lower pitch, almost foreboding, and is often elderly and thus has a hunch of some sort. He also has two key things which he often does with his hands. Either they are clasped in front of his chest, as if he is seeking to deceive or to enact some sort of deceit, or he is twirling a mustache, which the villain often has, to represent his scheming nature. Next slide. My performance convention that I'll be addressing today is the use of both movement and voice in relation to stock characters in Melodrama, and how they are used to effectively distinguish these stock characters and to what effect. Next slide. In order to explore this performance convention, I'll be performing a moment of theatre from the Duchess of Padua. The Duchess of Padua was a famous melodrama play written by Oscar Wilde, and is in the Victorian melodrama era, and is a very good example of what your stereotypical melodrama play would look like. For some context, in the scene that I'll be performing, the Duke of Padua has ordered his men to fire down upon the people of Padua for complaining about their state of poverty. In response to this, the Duchess of Padua throws herself in front of the crowd in an attempt to defend the crowd of people from the Duke's men. What ensues is a discussion between the Duke and the Duchess of why he is or isn't to blame for these people's extreme poverty. When the Duke would start his side of the dialogue, he would probably often have a hunched back in order to represent his elderliness, and he would have his hands clasped to his chest. For his first line, if you are poor, are you not blessed? He would turn to face the crowd, the audience, and would make a sweeping gesture across them as he is addressing them and wants their attention. He would then follow with his next line, for poverty is one of God's great virtues. While he is saying this, he would then turn to the damsel and point towards her as if he is making his point. After doing this, the villain would then say, is it not? And then pause for dramatic effect before leading with his head towards the cardinal who is standing there. Having done so, he would say, is it not Lord Cardinal, addressing the cardinal. He would then put his hands up to his mustache. He talks about this next part as he is in a scheming manner, and he would say, for you get great tithes and large estates for preaching, before turning again for dramatic effect, voluntary poverty, and turning his back on the cardinal in a sign of disrespect. He would also, throughout this, use a much lower tone and would be much more, almost of a booming voice, representing his evil nature. When put together, that would look something like this. If you are poor, are you not blessed? For poverty is one of the great Christian virtues. Is it not, Lord Cardinal? I know you receive rich tithes and large estates for preaching voluntary poverty. In response to this, the Duchess would say her side of the dialogue, and to start she would drop to her knees as if almost to beg. Her stature was also dropped here, representing the relationship between the two characters, and she would deliver her first line, which is, oh my lord, be kind, and then would gesture to herself, and while slowly standing, while we live in a noble house, pointing towards the house, uses her hands for many different expressions and is very visual and very large energy. While we live in this noble house, and then would gesture with her other hand, the people of Padua have nothing to shelter themselves from, and then with her hands would gesture to the various things as she describes them. The rude blast, the snow and the cold air that are tenants also, and at this point would lift her hands to her chest as if to signify sorrow, tenants with them, and would finish. Throughout this, she would be looking towards the villain, the Duke, often with sorrow and despair, and would make that expression very obvious. Her voice would also have a much higher register or pitch, as I talked about before, to represent her femininity. When put together, that would look something like this. Oh my lord, Be kind. While we live in this noble house, the people of Padua have nothing to shelter themselves from the cold air, the rude blast, and the snow that our tenants also with them. The effects of these different types of movement and voice techniques creates an interesting relationship between the two characters, emphasizing the shift in status between the much higher status villain in this moment and the much lower status damsel in distress, creating an important moment of tension and conflict that will later be resolved when the hero makes his grand entrance. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I would now like to draw a comparison between melodrama and commedia dell'arte. Next slide. Both of these theater traditions are very similar. They both employ stock characters, as well as using exaggeration, but they also have many differences. For instance, Il Capitano and the hero are two very similar characters. Both of them emphasize their masculine qualities, and both of them talk a lot about conflict. However, one of the key differences between Il Capitano and the hero is that Il Capitano is inherently a flawed character. Il Capitano is a coward and often displays that when conflict arises, whereas the hero is through and through a morally good character. Next slide, please. This is an important difference because it represents one of the fundamental differences between these two theater traditions. Melodrama was created with the intent to entertain, but also to give a moral message, whereas commedia dell'arte, being performed on the streets, was often used solely to entertain. And because of this, many vices in the characters are exaggerated, and they're all flawed characters. They do both also use love as a key theme, which is interesting and important to point out, with the hero and the damsel being melodrama, and the innamorati being commedia dell'arte. Importantly, you should also notice that exaggeration is definitely a key theme in both theatre traditions, and is used to comedic effect and to dramatic effect. Next slide, please. My exploration. In order to find the aspects of the various stock characters, I looked through a variety of sources. My first one was Octorok One, a theatre company that was performing a melodrama play. In order to do this, they had done much research on melodrama, looking through primary sources. Although this was a secondary source, I would say they were a very useful and a very trusted source. I also looked through silent films, which, although are not exactly melodrama, were heavily influenced by melodrama, and are one of the few examples of primary sources which can be taken for melodrama, as many melodrama plays were performed before there was video. The silent film I looked to was Diva della Fossa, an Italian silent film which was very heavily influenced by melodrama. Next slide, please. The effect on me. As an actor, the effect on me, melodrama had a very large effect on me. There was Keith Johnston, my theater arts solo performance based on Keith Johnston, the improv performer, practitioner. I found melodrama's exaggerated characters were very useful, as I was able to transfer them into improv and use them for great comedic effect, especially in the biggest game I play, which requires lots of exaggeration in order to, again, gain comic effect from the audience. Melodrama really furthered that. My director's notebook, I'm writing on Le Balcon, a surrealist French play, also heavily drew ideas from melodrama's use of music and symbolism, and there's a great parallel there which I was able to explore within it and reference several times. In a Prague youth theatre performance called Rewrite, I was able to use melodrama's exaggerated characters to create and further characters that were all I was performing, drawing them from the ground up and using those key characteristics to create more in-depth characters. And to link it to my IB subjects, the French Revolution and its relationship to melodrama was very important, as that is a piece on the curriculum in history we are currently studying, and was very interesting for me to learn more about. I am doing French as a language, and the etymology and history of melodrama was linked to that. And finally, in English, we're studying a play called Miss Julie, a realist play, which, interestingly enough, was heavily linked to melodrama's history, as melodrama was one of the key reasons realism was replaced as a traditional theatre style. Thank you.